I'm Barbara Mead. I'm one of the founders of Politics and Prose, and I retired at the end of December, but I come in from time to time to introduce authors whose books that I especially like, or that I especially like as a person, and that applied for both Bob Thompson, who's here to talk about his new book, Born on a Mountaintop. Bob has a backstory. He says that he was at one time a house painter. He was one time a librarian. He says that he did went to graduate school in American history and dropped out after 3 weeks. Um, he also spent 24 years as a feature writer for the Washington Post, and during that time he was the editor of the Post magazine section, and he also did a lot of author interviews for the style section. If you didn't come in here as a Crockettologist, I hope that you will leave as one. But you don't have to be as committed as Bob was to spend a whole year of his life following Davy Crockett with the hope of better understanding the metamorphosis of the man to legend that occurred over time. So here's Bob to talk about his book.
Thank you, Barbara. I was very happy to have Barbara come here to introduce me because I did spend a lot of time in this bookstore, both as a outsider just buying books and as a Washington Post reporter when it was my beat. And as you all know and don't have to be told, it's a wonderful bookstore. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy to see all of you here. Thank you for coming. And is this okay with the microphone? I'm not a little closer. Okay. Yeah. When people ask me how I came to write a book about Davy Crockett, I tell them it's all my elder daughter's fault. Lizzie was 4 years old. Her sister Mona was 2.5, and Deborah and I were entertaining them on some car ride or other by playing a collection of children's songs. The songs were on audio tape, which gives you some idea how long ago this was. The singer was Burl Ives, and at the very end of side 2, right after Polly Wolly Doodle, came a catchy tune the girls had never heard before. Born on a mountaintop in Tennessee, it went, green estate in the land of the free. After the music stopped, there was a moment of silence from the back seat. Then Lizzie said, "Play that song again." Pretty soon we were in our neighborhood library, checking out every book on Crockett we could find. A year and a half later, Lizzie was done with her Crockett phase, and the whole family knew a lot more about the King of the Wild Frontier than we had before. I was around for the original 1950s Crockett craze, but I missed it. My family had no TV, so I never saw the 3-part Disney series, in which an unknown actor named Fess Parker Jr. turned Davy into the coolest guy in American history. And I was even more clueless about the historical figure on whom he was based. The real David Crockett, who was born in a Tennessee river valley in 1786, grew up the dirt-poor son of a drunken tavern keeper. He ran away from home and almost to sea at age 13, fought Indians under Andrew Jackson, failed at farming, kept moving west, and discovered a knack for politics. In 1827, just as the expansion of democracy that we associate with Jackson was picking up steam, he got himself elected to Congress. Then his life really got interesting. Establishment Washington treated him as a living embodiment of the wild frontier. And before you could say bear hunting congressman from Tennessee, he'd been turned into a mega celebrity by the media culture of his time. What this meant was that Crockett reality and Crockett myth were hopelessly tangled up even before he died a hero's death at the Alamo and became immortal. And the more I learned about how the mythic Davy was created, the more fascinated I became. Years later, when I was looking for a book project, I decided to take that fascination on the road. Born on a Mountaintop is not a Crockett biography, though I like to say it contains one. My idea was to follow Crockett's footsteps from cradle to grave and beyond. I would walk where the real man walked, visit shrines to his memory from East Tennessee to Texas, and talk to the Crocketologists I met along the way, by which I mean the historians, curators, rangers, reenactors, descendants, and obsessive fans who are the keepers of his flame. All the while, I'd also be looking for a broader story, how real people and their truly eventful lives can morph into myth. I have a hard time picking out favorite moments from my Crockett tour because there were so many of them. People were always putting me in their trucks or hopping into my rental cars to show me the exact spot where David and Polly got married, or a well that he once dug, or the field in which he's said to have hosted a farewell bash before riding off to Texas. But one of my best days came in Lawrenceburg, Tennessee, about an hour and a half southwest of Nashville. There, I not only stumbled upon a strange and wonderful Crockett site that I wasn't expecting. Who knew that the King of the Wild Frontier had a downtown office? But I also talked my way into an off-season museum tour at beautiful David Crockett State Park. Lawrenceburg, which got left out of the Disney version, is central to the real man's story. Among other things, it's where he launched his political career. And I want to read you a passage in which I use the Park Museum to talk about what we know, or think we know, about Crockett's campaign style. The museum burned down in 1969, and the rebuilt version doesn't have much in the way of original Crockett artifacts. But it works hard to present a complex story in a small space. In the section on David's political career, I gravitated to an inspired wall display titled "A Manual of Dirty Politics, or How to Get Elected in Crockett's Time." Packaged as a list of rules and drawn from several stages of his career, it added up to a kind of Davy's greatest hits album, filled with chart-topping electoral tunes covered again and again in the standard works of Crockettology. I'd heard them all. By this time I could pretty much croon them from memory. Make your opponent appear to be a rich aristocrat to the backwoodsman voters, one rule read, referring to Crockett's 1823 campaign for the state legislature against the likable-sounding Dr. William Butler. At one point, Butler invited David to his home for dinner. That proved unwise. Taking note of a luxurious carpet on the floor, Crockett informed the voting public that his aristocratic opponent routinely walked on material finer than any gowns your wife or your daughters in all their lives ever wore. Speak and publish outright lies about your opponent, read another. That rule was from one of David's congressional races, in which a political foe accused him of drinking and womanizing. Crockett fired right back with worse charges, all false. Infuriated, the man showed up at a campaign event with witnesses primed to prove that David was lying. But David preempted them by pleading guilty. Lie about me, and I'll lie about you right back, was his message. The crowd loved it. Steal to buy liquor for the voters, referred to a hilarious tale in which Crockett, lacking the cash to treat some constituents to a round of whiskey, sold a coonskin to pay for it. When the whiskey seller wasn't looking, David swiped the same skin back and resold it, then repeated the maneuver over and over until everyone's thirst was quenched. I'll mention just one more, a rule enjoining politicians to discredit your opponent's morals. I think of it as, did you hear the one about Davy Crockett and the farmer's daughter? And I once heard the University of New Mexico historian Paul Andrew Hutton delight an audience with it at a Western Writers of America conference. Crockett was running for Congress, Hutton began, against a man named Adam Huntsman, who had lost a leg in the Creek War and sported a wooden one in its place. The two were campaigning together in a county where there was one wealthy farmer who pulled all the strings, and both stayed at the farmer's house. As you would imagine, being a wealthy farmer, he had a beautiful young daughter, and she had a bedroom downstairs, and Huntsman and Crockett were upstairs. After Huntsman had gone to bed and started snoring, Crockett picks up a chair, and he goes downstairs to the young, beautiful daughter's bedroom, and he jiggles the door, calling out, "Honey, it's me, Adam. I'm here. I know you want me." And she screams bloody murder. And then he's got the chair, remember? He goes running back upstairs. Hutton rapped on the lectern to imitate a man using a chair to imitate a man with a wooden leg. And then he finished up. That farmer comes out with his shotgun and says, "Huntsman, you son of a gun, get out of my house." Crockett wins his vote, gets the county's vote, goes to Congress, and God bless the American political system. I knew enough by now to be a bit skeptical of this one. Just for starters, Crockett lost the only election in which he and Huntsman faced each other. And yet, as I revisited those stories on the wall at the museum, it struck me that they posed a more serious obstacle to Crockettologists than mere fact-checking. Think of it as the legendary Davy syndrome, and think of me as its most recent victim. What had happened, I suddenly realized, was that I had started to see all those tales as utterly characteristic of the man I was trying to understand, even the ones I doubted were true. None of the stories mentioned above shows up in Crockett's autobiography, and they're all problematic in one way or another. The carpet episode, for example, is thinly sourced to begin with, and if you read Crockett's first real biographer's version of it, you'll notice that he simply made up the finer-than-any-gowns quote. Crockett concluded his tale, the biographer avers, with some such climax as this. The coonskin theft is recounted in an unauthorized Crockett biography whose normally scruple-free author introduces his own anecdote as one which I do not altogether believe. "Too good to check," my newsroom colleagues used to exclaim gleefully when encountering dubious but wildly entertaining pieces of news. But we had to check the darn things if we wanted to get them into the paper. I bring this up not to congratulate us on our professional skepticism. Despite our best efforts, or sometimes for the lack of them, plenty of unchecked whoppers got through. But to underline the deeply rooted human bias towards storytelling and entertainment over complex eat-your-broccoli forms of information. Crockett understood this instinctively. In his autobiography, he described his first attempt at speaking to a political crowd, in which he started out tongue-tied, but eventually found a way forward. This is what he wrote. "At last I told them I was like a fellow I had heard of not long before. He was beating on the head of an empty barrel near the roadside when a traveler who was passing along asked him what he was doing that for. The fellow replied that there was some cider in that barrel a few days before, and he was trying to see if there was any then, but if there was, he couldn't get at it. I told them that there had been a little bit of a speech in me a while ago, but I believed I couldn't get it out. They all roared out in a mighty laugh, and I told some other anecdotes equally amusing to them, and believing I had them in a first-rate way, I quit and got down, thanking the people for their attention." Could Ronald Reagan have done it better? And we haven't even gotten to the part where David persuaded his listeners to bail on the other speeches and join him for drinks. Life on the frontier was hard. Humor was a balm. And there's little doubt that Crockett's natural ability to connect with voters through laughter, however exaggerated or invented individual examples of it may be, fueled his political rise. Richard Boyd Houck, the author of a thoughtful 1982 study of David's life and legend, put it this way: "Crockett knew what folks liked to talk and joke about, and he understood perfectly how their humor offset the whole range of afflictions which weighed upon their lives. His audience included people who felt threatened by the complexities of authoritative or educated language, and by official deceptions or maneuverings. They loved his humor because it deflated politics and politicians, law and lawyers, power and the powerful." That's not a bad stopping place, I think, especially at a bookstore called Politics and Prose. But before I take some questions, I want to come back briefly to the song that started it all. One of the things I learned when I got to the Disney part of the story was that nobody had planned for those 1950s TV shows to include a mock folk ballad. But after Disney's crew finished filming, they discovered that they didn't have quite enough footage to fill 3 60-minute shows. So the screenwriter, Tom Blackburn, a man who had never written a song before, got teamed up with a veteran Disney composer and told to gin up something in a very big hurry. Studio legend says they came back with the Ballad of Davy Crockett in less than an hour. It turned out to be one of the stickiest songs ever written and became what's been called the carrying agent of the Crockett craze. And it's the reason we're all here today. Along with Lizzie Thompson, who's not 4 years old anymore, but who still represents the younger generation of Crockett fans. Lizzie, can you stand up and show off your coonskin cap? Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions anybody has.
There have been at least 2 films on the Alamo and how Davy met his demise. Did you see them, and what's your take on those?
Are you talking about that? Well, there's the Disney,
the John Wayne
and the
version.
John Wayne also.
Yeah, right.
Yes, I did see them, and actually, I have a whole chapter in the book on the question of how he actually died. And the one thing we can say absolutely for certain is that he did not die by throwing a torch into the powder magazine, which is the way he dies in the Wayne film, because that did not happen. Otherwise, the Alamo would have been blown up. But the Wayne film, which many, many people love, is a film which was not reality-based. And a film historian by the name of Frank Thompson, who I wish were a relation of mine, but he isn't, who loves the film and thinks it's one of Wayne's best, said basically there's not a thing in it that matches up with historical truth.
And the other one, the Disney version, is that closer to the truth?
The Disney version shows him in the pose that we are most used to seeing him, which is he's swinging his rifle because he's run out of ammunition. And the frame freezes with him, with his rifle swinging. The film does not actually show him dying, because remember, a lot of the audience was children, and they were worried about that. Okay. But the implication is that he goes down fighting. That is a very long story as to whether that's true or not, and I would be happy to answer some of it, but I refer you to chapter 11.
Okay.
Did he have any formal education? I mean, you mentioned he was very poor and that he'd run away at 13, and it seems like obviously he was quick-witted, but also sounded kind of literate, too, from what you described.
There's a couple of parts to the answer to that. Let me take the second part first. He wrote the book with a fellow congressman who was much more literate than he was. And the general consensus is that it's Crockett's voice, but this guy cleaned it up and made it work as a piece of literature. In terms of his formal education, he had several days at a local school, and one of the reasons, or the reason he ran away from home, is that he got in a fight, and then he stopped going to school because he was afraid he'd be whipped by the schoolmaster. And then his father found out and became furious because his father was paying for him to go to school. There were no free schools in those days. And so he lit out running and didn't come back for 2.5 years. Later on, and this is, I think this is an impressive thing about him, he fell in love with somebody who rejected him for reasons that may or may not have anything to do with his education, but he felt that he would have a better chance in the world if he were educated. So he contracted with someone he knew to trade labor for probably about 6 months of schooling. And so he could read and write. If you read his letters, there's a great difference between the speeches that he got help with and the letters that he wrote himself. But I hope that answers.
Yeah, thank you.
Crockett seems to have been a guy who captured the imagination of Americans of the 1820s and 30s, and then 1950s and 60s, and even until today. I can't think of many people like that in American public life. Was there a period where he disappeared from our folklore imagination, and why do you think it is that he's got that for us?
Well, he was a very famous man when he was in the the frontier. And at that time, the Eastern establishment was sort of fascinated with the frontier. They both were excited by it and a little terrified by it. And so he became kind of the representative of frontierness. He was in a play that somebody put him in a play under a wonderful non-Crockett name. He was called Nimrod Wildfire. And but everybody knew it was Crockett. And then there was this unauthorized biography that became a bestseller, and then he wrote his own. And so he was a very famous man. He was by far the most famous man at the Alamo. And then the Alamo was an iconic battle that made him famous. And he was thoroughly in the American imagination throughout the 19th century. And there were silent movies made about him, but eventually he started to fade out a little bit. And I quote somebody whose name I'm not going to be able to dredge up, who was writing in the 40s or maybe the early 1950s, and he said, if you had said that we would forget who Davy Crockett was, we would have said no, impossible. But he had kind of faded out when Disney chose him. And then the Disney thing completely brought him back into the center of attention.
Hi, Bob. I wondered if you found a common denominator among the Crocketologists, as did they overlap much with other sort of historical subcultures? Were there any women among them? What were they like, sort of as a group?
Well, it's a term that I invented.
Right.
And it's an umbrella term, so I throw everybody in there. I have to tell you one little side story about that. I'd written 2/3 or 3/4 of the book, and I went back to the Alamo to the 175th anniversary, and I ran into Paul Hutton, who I quoted earlier. And we were talking, and Paul said, you have to read this book. There's this great book that just came out. It's called Custerology. And I thought, oh my God. They're mostly guys, they're mostly of a certain age, but not entirely. Whenever I mentioned what I was working on, people would burst into song. And a couple of my favorite people who burst into song were at Washington on the Brazos, Texas, the historic site. And they were women who worked in the park shop. And one of them was introduced as our real Crockett expert, and she had a picture of him on her cell phone. And at some point, the other one was asking why she didn't get back earlier to meet me, and while she had the cell phone turned off, and she said, if it had been Davy, we'd have answered him, and she said he's got his private ring. There are fewer women, and the ones that stick in my head, there were a couple of Crockett descendants who I talked to who are deeply knowledgeable and interesting about him. And there's also the ranger at the park that I read about is a young woman named Rachel Lee, who is fabulous and embodies some of the spirit of that time, I think.
And can we all sing the song? Yeah?
We certainly could.
Just a thought.
I bet a few people know the words.
You mentioned the woman with the cell phone with the image of Davy
Yes.
Crockett, which just made me wonder. So I guess that was a little too early for the first daguerreotypes or photographs of any sort.
Yes.
But given his popularity, if you come across any famous paintings or portraits or anything like that of him, or how what images might there be of him, if you know?
Yes, there are a lot of paintings. I should point out that that's Richard Avedon, who is Lizzie's beloved teacher from her high school. Beloved and history teacher, and a little scary sometimes, so I was a little nervous about that question. Yes, almost all the images show Crockett in what I call his congressman clothes. He was not painted before he went to Congress because he was too poor. He didn't get painted. The most interesting image of Crockett that exists, in my view, happened when he was having his portrait painted, and it's quite a good portrait, but he was dissatisfied with it. He thought, this looks just like all the others. And so he said, what you really ought to do, you ought to paint me like in the frontier on a bear hunt, in hunting clothes. And this was 1834. This is the peak of his fame. And so he essentially staged a portrait of himself to project a frontier image. He went out, he was in Washington, he didn't have his clothes, he didn't have his rifle, he went out and borrowed a coat, he borrowed a rifle, and he insisted on having real mutts, not purebred hunting dogs. So he said, there's a lot of them around here, we've got to go get some real ones. And so there's this fabulous thing, it's in the book, it's of Crockett, in his frontier garb, which did not include a coonskin cap in this image, but it's really a political image that he had made for himself.
Hi. Crockett and Andy Jackson split over Indian removal, as I understand. Did they ever patch up their differences?
No. And they split over many things. Indian removal was one of them. Crockett started out as a Jackson supporter and evolved into someone who was vehemently opposed to him. That's one of the reasons he was defeated in his final election. There's a little bit of a myth about his career ending because of his Indian removal vote. He voted against Jackson's Indian removal bill, which was a courageous and good thing for him to do, and he did lose his next election, but then he was reelected after that. So that wasn't the immediate cause of his demise, but him running down Jackson constantly probably had something to do with it. And no, they never made up. Jackson did not like him at all, although he was a small figure compared to Jackson. Anybody else? I'm betting Steve Luxembourg has a question. He always has questions. All right.
Patch up the Liberty Bell myth come from?
That came from the Disney screenplay and the song. And one of the reasons that the screenwriter who wrote the song died in 1992, I would have loved to talk to him. Because when I watched the Disney movie, I realized that I knew pretty much where everything was coming from in that movie. I knew what the sources were. He turned it all around and used it for his own purposes, but I could see where they were coming from. But the Liberty Bell, it's just a phrase that he made up to indicate that he was like a good guy in Congress. And in fact, he had one major goal in Congress, and he was not able to accomplish it. So he didn't patch up any Liberty Bells.
I just don't think we can end this without your clarifying whether this is an authentic historic object, this coonskin cap.
That's the one that my daughter Lizzie was wearing. That is an authentic historic object. I bought it in Rutherford, Tennessee, at Davy Crockett's last home in Rutherford, Tennessee, which is a reconstructed cabin which claimed for many years to be built of real logs from his real cabin, but that turns out not to be true. And I'm ducking your question about the cap. We don't have any evidence from anyone who said anything when Crockett was alive about him wearing a coonskin cap. That doesn't prove that he didn't, but there are a number of people, maybe 4 or 5, who recalled decades later that he wore a coonskin cap. And there's kind of a longish story about why we probably think he had a coonskin cap, which, if everybody is a little patient, it has to do with that play I was talking about where the character was called Nimrod Wildfire. And he was a famous actor named James Hackett, and he appeared on stage in a frontier costume, including not a coonskin cap, but he had some kind of wildcat on his head. It's literally like a bobcat on his head. And there was an engraving of this that was well known. And then when the Crockett Almanacs came along, after Crockett died, they just stole this image and put it on the cover and labeled it as Davy. And the academic Crockettologists, which is a subset of the Crockettologists, pretty much think that that's why we think Davy wore a coonskin cap. You can get some fights from other kinds of Crockettologists over this topic. But
we got one more question?
Well, since you challenged me, Bob.
Excellent, excellent.
So what were the years that Crockett was in Congress?
He was elected in 1827, and then he was defeated after 2 terms, so he left from 31 to 33, and then he was back from 33 to 35.
So one of the major issues of the day during that period was the division between North and South.
Yes.
And the slavery issue. And did he have any role and position and thoughts about that?
That's an excellent question. This is my old colleague, Steve Luxembourg. And he really didn't have anything to say about that. He's from Tennessee, which was a slave-holding area. He himself was too poor to have slaves until he married Elizabeth Crockett, who was a little better off, and they had a few slaves, but Davy was constantly in debt and constantly losing money, so he eventually had to sell them because he was broke. And he never said anything that I know of to indicate that he had any problem with slavery, which is a paradox because he was so good on treating Native Americans as real people that he did not follow suit on the slavery thing. Jackson, of course, had a plantation with 100 slaves, and it was not questioned in Tennessee at the time, but it does sound a little odd for Crockett to have.
Not so much, since, as you know, slavery was embedded in the Constitution through property, and so you had to be. There were very few in Tennessee, I bet, that were anti-slavery.
Well, I think that's true. I think the thing that struck me was how forceful he was on Indian rights when he decided to do that, and how odd it seems from our perspective that he would do that and not think about slavery.
Okay, thank you, Bob.
Thank you very much.
Okay, if people will help us fold up the chairs, please, and lean them against something solid. If you line up to my left, Bob will sit up here and sign copies of his book. Thanks for coming.